Hello dear internet, let's talk composition. I absolutely love talking about composition, I love studying composition. It's one of the most fundamentally expressive things you can do. You're literally deciding what to show in your frame and what not to show. And you're choosing the relative size of these objects in your frame and where you place them. And it's really not a gear thing at all. It applies to everything. Any kind of photography, any kind of lens, and that's why it's so fundamental, that's why it's so important, and that's why we're going to dig into this today. People will tell you that there are rules about composition, and there are no rules. There are, however, some really good principles and guidelines for composition, and it's a really good thing to know about these and train to use these. Because what you're really trying to do is get your brain away from just automatically take every picture kind of as you see it. And that's what you tend to do at the beginning. You're doing this sort of bullseye composition where exactly what you're looking at, that's just what you're shooting. And when you get a lot more practice, you can start to compose and frame and choose which things go into your frame. And that's what we're going to dive into today. There are some really good guidelines and principles to help you get going. Thirds, center, triangular, golden ratio, wacky compositions, load the composition. There's all kinds of a billion different terms and stuff for it, and we're just going to deal pretty much with a couple today. So let's look at a couple of examples. Thirds. This is probably the most well-known. And the idea with thirds is that basically, if you take the time to kind of place your subject or your horizon on one of the third lines or one of the intersection of the thirds, then you get a more dynamic, a more interesting composition. It can be super effective, and it's probably what I would recommend that you start out learning if you're just starting to think about composition. It is simply to get away from that bullseye thinking and start placing things at the thirds. For example, if you're shooting a landscape, you're telling the viewer that you couldn't make up your mind if you're placing it horizon dead center, unless you're working really deliberately very symmetrical, very mirrored image. But if you're not, you're just telling them that everything is equally important. And that's probably not true. You probably have an image where you're saying that either the sky is really important. You're placing the horizon on the lower third, or maybe the foreground is really important, so you place the horizon up on the upper third. So that's one step. And then you can start to place, maybe there's a main object. There could be a tree, there could be a rock, any kind of foreground, there could be a person. So that's probably going to be placed maybe at one of the thirds to the side. Maybe there are even two subjects and you place them on the opposing thirds, and that's a very effective way as well. And the thing about this is that you're translating reality into something that is a frozen 2D image. And while it's quite natural, the way we see is this. I mean, how I'm sitting now, that's probably how you would look at me if we were sitting across the table from each other. We wouldn't be doing the, hang on, I'm placing you at the thirds, it looks better. But it's a different thing when you're taking it into a still image and you're freezing it. You need elements that tell a more dynamic tale of foreground, background, middle ground, importance, relative size of objects. It's effective, and as you get better at it, you can add stuff to it. You start thinking about leading lines, you can add symmetry, you can add several subjects into it, you can load the frame and still use the thirds, and that's all part of the fun. You can keep getting better at this. Center composition. Didn't I just say we're trying to get away from bullseye? Yes, but we're trying to get away from the bullseye where you don't think about it. The center composition can be an incredibly effective way of composing an image if you're doing it very deliberately, very symmetrical, very balanced. For me, shooting concerts, the center composition is quite often a very logical choice because you're looking at a stage that is very often symmetrical. Very rarely do you see a stage that's kind of built on a thirds principle. So the center composition can be very effective for concerts, but again, you have to work it. You have to clear the sides and make them balanced, or maybe have 3 people or 5 people. And if you don't have that, then it's better to move to the side a bit, I find, and then you place them on the thirds. So this is like a thing that has to go on in your brain all the time as you're moving around where you're photographing, whether it's the street or the landscape or the concert or the studio, whatever you're doing. The awesome thing with any kind of principle of composition is once you kind of start to learn these basics, you can add stuff to it and you can make your own. I mean, you can really make your presence known here. This is actually how I feel that I can see the photographer in the frame. The composition is so important. It's such a vital part of your artistic expression. Much more vital than any kind of tech choice, any kind of preset, any kind of filters or whatever. The composition is something that you can really work at and make your own. That's what I really love about it. You can mold these to fit your vision, but you have to find it first, and that's where you have to make your brain work and think about this. Much more, again, than any type of gear, think composition. The relative size of objects in the frame. Didn't I just say that gear didn't matter? Well, there's one area where your choice of lens and aperture is actually an artistic tool that really can make a difference, because obviously you want objects in your picture to have a relative size depending on what's important, which story you're trying to tell. You're trying to place the viewer in the frame and you're trying to tell them this person, for example, is super important, but this person is in focus and at the front and larger and even more important. This is done through composition, and it's done also through a lens choice. Because obviously, if you're going for a wide angle or a tele, it's gonna make a big difference. Telephoto is gonna compress everything a lot more. That can be used for some effects, or it can ruin images too. And wide angle is gonna push the background away a lot more. So you get a massive difference between the foreground and the background. The relative size of objects that you're seeing is roughly 50 millimeter, 50, 60. And this means if you're looking at a beautiful landscape and you're thinking, wow, those mountains are incredible, not only are you seeing this at least 50 mil, your brain is also magnifying the clouds or the mountains in the background, for example, and making them large. And then you put on a wide angle, and what does a wide angle do? It pushes the background really far away and you're left with an enormous amount of foreground that's maybe not particularly interesting. So wide angle is not, for example, always a great example for a great choice for landscapes. Maybe it's a lot better to go 50 or above, because you're at least trying to put the viewer into that frame that your eye is seeing. I love to use wide angle, but that's because I love to always be really close. And then the wide angle tells the story of being incredibly close in the action, but you can still see the environment, so I can still show that I am on stage and I also have a background. And this is where the wide angle really shines. It's actually the only way to document this. An example of the opposite is, for example, when I do these pictures of the orange stage. And it looks kind of like it's a wide angle because it's a reasonably wide field of view, but that's because I'm standing really, really far back. There's a kind of an elevation to the grassy field in front of the orange stage. So if you go all the way to the back, that's your best view. You're kind of looking down a little bit so you get a better view of the field. But this means you're really far from everything, but you have 120,000 people in front of you. And that's what you're trying to capture, and the emotion and the excitement and this beautiful orange stage in the background. So if I do this with a wide angle, it looks like this. It magnifies the front. You can see all the people here, and it pushes the stage really far away, even further than it actually is to my eye. So when I do pictures like this, it's always 50 or above, because what I want to actually do is take that stage and pull it right up and fill the frame, and then have all of these excited hands. And there's no way you can tell there's now 120,000 people here, but it implies that anyway, and you get the scale of everything and the stage. And that's not a wide angle. You may think it is, but it is not. The wide angle is not suited at this point because I'm not trying to document the foreground, I'm actually trying to document the background. Negative space and the spacing of subjects. This is a little pet thing of mine. The first principle of the negative space thing is that if you have a lead singer, for example, standing right here as I am now, singing straight to you, might look pretty nice with the center composition if it's balanced and the sides are clear. But if I'm singing this way, it looks, if you place it on this third, it kind of looks like I'm exiting the frame. So it's better if you sing or point or look in this direction. You leave some negative space for the subject to look into or move into or drive into or whatever. Sometimes it works the other way, where it's really cool to have people sort of exiting the frame. That can also be cool. But in general, this idea of negative space, balancing out and leaving an empty space next to the subject can work well, especially if they're kind of doing a motion or looking into the negative space. Now, the spacing of subjects means that when you have more than one subject in the frame, and this is a really pet thing of mine, you want to be really careful with the space between them. And if you move just a little bit when you're taking the picture, all the items relative in the frame will move quite a lot. And that's a really important thing, because what you can do, even if you can't move much, just moving a little bit side to side, you can still move, for example, in my case, the singer away from the microphone stand, or maybe the singer is blocking the drummer, and you take a little bit to the left or the right, and it's solved. You move just a little bit and you get this spacing. And what's even more cool sometimes, if you can evenly space it out, 3 or 5 people, trees, subjects, landscapes, whatever, but they're kind of evenly spaced. It's a nice repetition that the brain really likes. Spacing of subjects, think about that. Think about moving just a little bit. Things that are close to you will move a lot in frame if you just move yourself a little bit. So don't be lazy, don't stand still. Move all the time. I'm going to introduce a term that I think my buddy Zane Paxton from San Francisco once introduced to me, called visual tension. And it's something that I really like to think about. It's used a lot in reportage and movies and everything. And you're kind of breaking the frame by doing this, which I absolutely love about it. And the idea is, if you have all your pictures where everything is always neatly contained, it gets a bit dull. It also means you can always see where things end. If I contain the entire audience, we know that's, it doesn't go on forever. This is where it ends. It's nicely contained. And sometimes it's just really nice to have things break out of frame, cut people in half. If you watch a lot of movies, you will see that they're often not framed where they're completely contained all the time. They get tension by breaking them out of the frame. And I love doing that. Study the very complex composition of someone like the master Magnum photographer Alex Webb, and look at how he really loads the composition and quite often also breaks the frame. Study movies and study a lot of reportage photography as well. What do I use? Well, basically everything I just said. Those are all my things, my advice, my principles. I absolutely love to be close. I want to put you right in the action of whatever I photograph. It's just the way I like to document things. Whether it's a concert, rodeo, procession, you need to feel like you're in there, like you're literally getting hit by things. That's how I want you to feel. How do you get better? Well, of course you have to work. You have to practice, you have to shoot. But you can also study a lot. There's actually a lot of cool stuff that you can study about this, because everyone uses compositions. It's not just photographers, it's cinematographers, it's painters, it's everyone. And ask yourself this: how many gear movies about photography gear have you seen on YouTube versus how many have you seen about composition? I want to say dial it down a bit on the gear side maybe and start watching a lot about composition. And you can watch a lot about cinema composition. It applies equally well. And I want to say that You can turn on a grid, for example, for thirds in cameras, in a lot of cameras. And it can be a really good helper, I find, at the beginning. Maybe you're trying to train your brain to look at these things. But first of all, it's not a mathematical competition. It doesn't have to be placed exactly at the thirds. Don't make that the object. The object is still to make a very strong, good picture. So it can be a good learning tool for teaching your brain. But at some point, you want to be more like Obi-Wan. Don't trust the grid. Reach out with your feelings and just feel the image and the composition. And then practice. Get out there and make some pictures and go home and analyze them and look at everything in the frame. Where did you place it? What's the relative sizing? Are you showing what you want to show? Did you manage to sort of cut out what you don't want to show? Are you telling the story you wanted to tell? And are you placing the viewer in the picture the way you want to? And I hope you enjoy this movie, and shoot me any questions and emails, comments, anything you like, and see you next time.